Congo Variant by Robin Crumby, read by Rue Morris. Prologue. The Dark Ages may return on the gleaming wings of science, and what might now shower immeasurable material blessings upon mankind may even bring about its total destruction. Beware, I say, time may be short. Winston Churchill, 5th March 1946. UK Government Research Facility, near Salisbury, United Kingdom, 2nd March 1998, 0400 hours. The darkest hours before dawn held few surprises for an expert in infectious disease. Safety was a mantra so routine as to be instinctive. Antisocial hours, icy roads, the impenetrable darkness of tree-lined roads in winter were all part and parcel of the night shift. Dr. Ben Littlejohn turned right at the bottom of a steep hill, full-beam headlights illuminating the low stone wall that still bore the scars of the last person who failed to negotiate the tight corner on a country road notoriously slippery in early spring. He yawned and rubbed the sleep from his eyes, turning again onto an anonymous approach road lined with a high chain-link fence topped with barbed wire. A sign at the entrance gave little indication of the clandestine activities undertaken at this industrial facility located next to a nondescript business park. He fumbled for his ID in a black leather day bag on the passenger seat, a birthday gift from his wife. He rolled to a halt at the checkpoint. The security guard shone a penlight at the security pass before waving him through with a polite nod. Littlejohn parked up next to an austere warehouse building. Wisps of smoke or steam from the chimney towering over the complex caught the light from below before disappearing into a moonlit sky. Pinpricks of light from a sleepy village less than 2 miles southwest of the installation twinkled in the darkness, its stalwart residents oblivious to their proximity to danger. A serious accident here could extinguish human life in a heartbeat. Littlejohn had dedicated his career to ensuring a leak like that could never happen on his watch. When friends and family asked about his work, he trotted out well-rehearsed lines about tracking outbreaks of various tropical diseases, annual visits to monitor cases where they occurred in the world, and the development of vaccines. Depending on who he was talking to, he might throw in a mention of biocontainment, gene therapy, or drug development, by which time most people's eyes became sufficiently glazed to deter any follow-up questions. He hung up his raincoat and scarf in a locker in the staff room, changed into a starched white lab coat, clipped his security badge to his top pocket that displayed his name, military designation, identification number, and the unflattering photo he had always hated. There was something about the overhead strip light that made his forehead appear shiny, thinning grey hair too greasy. Frozen across his unsmiling lips was the dark mood from that particular morning. The argument with his wife, words she could never take back, personal criticism he would never entirely forgive. Littlejohn nodded at the disinterested security guard on reception, whose sidearm lay next to the keyboard in its holster alongside a half-eaten packet of biscuits. The heavily reinforced security door buzzed open, giving access to the biosecure containment zones beyond. The electrical hum from a generator filled the air, running day and night in case of temporary interruption to mains power. Even at this early hour, the inner sanctum was busy. Littlejohn recognized the same handful of scientists and military personnel, night shift workers like him, scuttling along narrow corridors, heads down, immersed in their thoughts. He passed successive laboratories where lone technicians peered down microscopes, running tests, absorbed by their work. Those already finished for the night would be heading home to their beds. The far end of the complex was even quieter. He keyed in an access code and the pressure seals around the door hissed open. The specialists who worked here knew this secure area of level 3 and 4 biocontainment zones as Hades. The name had always struck Littlejohn as fitting in so many ways. In Greek mythology, Hades had been the god of the underworld, a place of the dead and dying. The day-to-day reality of working here was a little less dramatic. A suite of negative pressure, ultra-secure biocontainment laboratories allowed the study of the planet's most deadly pathogens. Marburg, Ebola, even the bubonic plague. Mistakes here incurred heavy consequences: quarantine, hospitalization, even death. Hades was reserved for the most experienced scientists, requiring additional precautions, multiple vaccinations, and two-person safety protocols at all times. Through the reinforced plexiglass, almost an inch thick, was the so-called Red Room, a cramped office used by Little John's team. Beside his desk was an airtight medical crate that resembled a cool box or hot box, depending on your point of view. Such deliveries were a regular feature of their work here. A plastic wallet attached to the crate would provide need-to-know information as to the sample's contents and provenance. Sometimes they tested blind. Little John's security clearance meant that he knew more than most, but occasionally samples crossed his desk that he was required to identify with minimal context. That was the job. No questions asked. On the whiteboard, Little John's day shift counterpart had scribbled the other items of note, including priorities for this morning. The diminutive scientist pulled with all his might against the negative pressure door, which resisted his slight frame until the rubber seal gave way and the air pressure began to equalize. Inside was a staging area where Little John's fellow technician, Major Andrea Pollard, was already half dressed in a surgical scrub suit, tapping her watch, waiting to help him get ready. "What's so urgent this couldn't wait till morning?" Little John asked, unbuttoning his shirt and closing the cubicle door. The two of them had worked together for so long, the awkwardness had gone. He barely thought of her as a member of the opposite sex. To him, she was a colleague and partner. Their lives depended on each other's vigilance and professionalism. "Your guess is as good as mine. I got the same page of messages you did, Ben. Anyway, it wouldn't be any fun if they gave us clues." "Certainly keeps things interesting," observed Little John with a wry smile. Above the white noise of the air handlers, he could just make out the muffled screech from what they called the zoo. Housed in separate cages in a sealed environment next to the laboratory were 24 marmoset monkeys. To a virus, the primates looked almost identical to human beings, making them ideal subjects for the tests they were undertaking. Little John showered, wrinkling his nose at the stink of the powerful disinfectant gel. He dried himself with a fresh towel, donned clean socks and underwear, and a green surgical gown to match his colleagues. He wrapped tape tight round his ankles and sleeves to make a seal. Next came latex gloves, completing his first protective layer. He turned his attention to assist Pollard as she wriggled into a biohazard suit that resembled a pressurized spacesuit, holding her arms out for him to secure the chest zip before checking the seals at the wrists and ankles, closely inspecting the heavy-duty rubber gloves until he was satisfied there were no tears in the material. The puncture-resistant rubber made handling laboratory equipment somewhat cumbersome, but protected the most vulnerable areas of the body, the hands, from accidents or contamination with a hot agent. Then came his turn. She repeated the process, meticulously checking his seals and equipment before giving him the thumbs up. Last came their helmets. The instant he squeezed his head through the narrow gap, the perspex screen began to fog until all he could hear was his own labored breathing. He remembered the first time he had put on one of these suits, how claustrophobic it had felt, the rising panic that could make even an experienced lab worker claw at their face and try to tear the suit clean off. Doing that inside a level 4 laboratory would be a death sentence, like a deep-sea diver removing their helmet at the bottom of the ocean. He reached over and calmly connected the coiled yellow hose to the socket on his suit. After the stifling suffocation, the roar of air flowing around his body was intoxicating. He watched the arms and legs of the yellow suit inflate with the positive pressure. There was a slight metallic taste to the recycled air that reminded him of diving holidays abroad with rented scuba gear before he signed up for this demanding role. He admonished himself for wandering thoughts. In this environment, concentration and discipline were critical. Staring at the steel door to the airlock that separated them from the biocontainment area beyond, He marshaled his breathing, falling into a steady rhythm like his instructor and mentor had taught him years ago, waiting for Dr. Pollard to carry the samples into the airlock and finish her preparation. The door sealed behind them with a hiss, and nozzles began to spray them from top to toe with chemicals, draining away through a grill on the floor. The red light above the exit turned green, and the door unlocked, allowing access to Hades, the secure biocontainment area beyond. In the Red Room, Little John logged into the computer terminal and read through the notes left by his day shift counterpart. The previous cool box, emblazoned with a biohazard warning symbol, had arrived almost 4 days earlier with instructions to test for all known pathogens. A full screen and battery of tests took time. The monkeys in the zoo greeted the scientists' arrival with a cacophony of screeching, fiercely territorial in their individual cages. Little John reconnected his air hose to a central supply hanging from the ceiling in the middle of the room and got to work. He retrieved the clipboard listing the observations for each monkey, flipping through for anything of note. 24 test subjects. They had injected 12 with what they were calling XC4328. A digital clock counted down every second since exposure. Just under 96 hours so far. The other 12 monkeys were the control group, administered with a harmless placebo. It was hard to hear anything over the roar of the air in the suit, but the first test subject, Alpha, one of the controls, bared its teeth, screeching a warning as Little John approached with clipboard in hand. The monkey repeatedly charged the front of the cage in a show of aggression that suggested the adult male was in rude health. Little John's eyes flicked to the padlock to make sure it was secure and the key removed. Despite the diminutive size, these were dangerous creatures. Escape was unthinkable. The next 2 monkeys rattled their cages in protest, but were more muted in response. The condition of the 4th was of immediate concern. Subject Delta lay on its back, staring at the ceiling, eyelids flickering as if in a dreamlike state. Little John tapped the cage door with a pen, but there was no reaction. He leaned closer to get a better look, feet planted behind the yellow safety line painted on the linoleum floor. A half-eaten biscuit lay by the monkey's side. The subject's lethargy and shallow breathing concerned him. There was no question the mystery pathogen had attacked the immune system as predicted. Little John noted his observations on the sheet before moving on to the next cage. "Ben!" shouted Pollard, tapping him on the shoulder and pointing to the penultimate cage. His colleague's concern was understandable. The marmoset's torso appeared twisted, legs contorted as if in some frozen spasm. Eyes half open, almost glassy in appearance, he noted later. Blood trickled from one nostril before pooling beside its tiny body. There was no sign of pain. Its cheeks and forehead seemed drawn downwards by an invisible force. Subconsciously, Little John distanced himself, determined to remain calm, working through the probabilities. The cage was a vision of hell, worthy of Hades himself. He exchanged a concerned glance with Pollard. There was little that surprised the team down here. They had worked with almost every pathogen known to man, and yet the sight of this tiny monkey's body, ravaged by disease in under 4 days, terrified him. He checked the sheet again, barely believing the transformation. Yesterday's lethargy and loss of appetite had mutated into full-blown hemorrhage and fever. The monkey's motionless ankle and foot lay tantalizingly close to the cage door. Little John deliberated whether he should take a sample safely without exposing himself to danger should the infected monkey stir. Safety protocols dictated the use of a tranquilizer. A bite or scratch from a monkey could easily puncture a glove or suit. Caution prevailed, and he resolved to return with the tranquilizer once he had completed the inspection. 2 further marmosets were at a similar stage of infection. However, what concerned Little John most was the sight of one of the control subjects slumped against the back of the cage, staring blankly into the distance, totally unresponsive. He checked the notes again, assuming a colleague had made a mistake, or they had moved the animals for some unknown reason. Scientists jumping to unsubstantiated conclusions had undone hard-won reputations for rigor. He would not make that rookie mistake. Before raising the alarm, the experienced scientists would need to be certain. One by one, they injected the affected monkeys with a tranquilizer until each cage fell silent, their heaving chests settling into a relaxed rhythm, and he could safely draw blood and tissue samples for further analysis. Back in the laboratory, he carefully prepared the samples before peering down the high-powered electron microscope. His normally steady hand trembled with excitement, impatient for the image to come into focus. Little John zoomed in further into an alien world of valleys and mountains, hunting down the microscopic virus invisible to the naked eye. A force of nature so destructive it could detonate inside individual cells like a nuclear bomb. It didn't take him long to pick up its trail. Millions, perhaps billions, of tiny snake-like strands, threads of virus tangled together as if in the throes of ecstasy. There was no question. It was a filovirus. From his extensive research, he was aware of only 2 pathogens that could wreak this level of damage, but had never come face to face with either, Marburg or Ebola. He checked the textbook next to the keyboard, cross-checking what he was seeing with the black and white photo. Something about the sample looked different. Only further tests would determine for sure. He zoomed in further, zeroing in on a single strand of virus silhouetted against a cell wall from which it had emerged. His index finger fumbled for the red button, capturing the image and sending it to the printer on the far side of the room. A mugshot of the offender that might just seal the deal on a long-overlooked promotion. Little John tilted his head, studying the printout, allowing himself a moment of self-satisfaction with his handiwork. Back in the red room, he hesitated before reaching for the telephone mounted on the wall, checking the time. It was only 5:15 in the morning. Perhaps he should fax the photo to his boss's home number and wait until after 6 before calling. No, Major General Phillips would want to know immediately. He rifled through the staff Rolodex until he located the number. "Sir, it's Dr. Littlejohn from CT6. He swallowed his nerves, listening to the rustle of bedclothes, his boss clearing his throat, slowly levering himself upright, perhaps taking a sip of water from a bedside table. "Do you have any idea what time it is, Littlejohn?" He sounded groggy, irritable, like always. Perhaps it had been a mistake not to wait until 6. "Yes, sir. What on earth couldn't wait until the morning?" "The samples we received last Tuesday?" "Yes, what about them?" "We believe we're looking at a novel strain of hemorrhagic fever." There was a stunned silence. "Who else is there with you?" "Major Pollard." "And she's corroborated this?" "Yes, sir." "Well, let's not get ahead of ourselves." If there was an explanation, Little John didn't know what it was. "Run the tests again, can you? And when you've done that, run them again." "Sir, we've double-checked the results. It's hemorrhagic fever, all right. I can fax you a photo." He could hear Phillips sitting up straighter now, fully awake. "Back up, will you? Tell me exactly what tests you've run." Little John walked the Major General through the detailed notes he had scribbled down in preparation for the call. One of the subjects had died, 2 others had advanced symptoms. He hesitated before mentioning the control subject, knowing only too well the gravity of what he was about to say. "Sir, one of the controls has developed early-stage symptoms." There was a pause as Phillips considered what Little John was saying. "Could it be cross-contamination somehow?" "We're waiting for confirmation from the day shift, but it looks like they followed all the protocols. We believe XC4328 could be airborne." Little John swallowed hard. "Now listen carefully. Here's what I want you to do. Call Farrier and Cooper. I want the whole CT6 team in my office by 1000. Until then, you're to mention this to no one. I want everything typed up and faxed to my office within the hour." "Yes, sir, I'll need to tell the others something." "Tell them you have a suspected case of hemorrhagic fever, nothing more. I'll be there within the hour. This stays between us, Ben." "Yes, sir." Little John's boss had never called him by his first name. It took him by surprise. The line went dead as he stared at the receiver, Imagining the chain of events their discovery had just initiated, he thumbed through the index cards, looking for Major Farrier and Dr. Cooper's numbers. Major General Phillips replaced the receiver on a cluttered bedside table and ran a hand through thinning grey hair, marshalling his thoughts. He grabbed the handset and punched the numbers he knew by heart. After half a dozen rings, the line connected. "George, it's Tom. Those lab results came in. You were right. It's not monkeypox. Little John thinks it could be hemorrhagic fever. It might even be Marburg or Ebola." There was a light static on the line, but no audible response. Finally, Curran cleared his throat. "We should wait for the autopsies to be certain." There was no emotion in his voice, as if he half expected to be having this conversation. "It looks like our friends are up to their old tricks again." Curran hung up without answering.